Psalm 1, you've heard me say it, mention it, bring it up, encourage you to memorize it, and so on for several weeks, right? It starts like this. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. I think one of the reasons that this appeals to me so much is that it is this logical series of instructions, things that even you and I can grab a hold of. We are cautious, I hope, not to take counsel from the wicked. And people that we clearly know are trouble, we try not to take advice from them. So I think we're good there. And I think we are equally cautious about not hanging around with people whose lives are mired in sin. That's not to say we don't associate with them, but we don't hang around with them to the degree that we begin to fall into that trap. We're cautious about that. It's that last little bit about sitting in the seat of mockers where we waver a little bit, because clearly none of us are mockers. And so it becomes hard for us to decide who and what a mocker might be, right? We're very cautious, I hope, and I think, about our reputation. We're cautious about the things that we do, the things that we say, the people that we run with, and all of those kinds of things. Yes, would you agree with me on that? Here's the trouble. I look around this room and I think otherwise, right? If I look around this room, I see a bunch of lawbreakers. Now don't look, James, you see his head whip up there? James's head came from full down to up in a half of a second there, because he's interested to see who the lawbreakers may be. You don't have to look very far, James. Now, I know you're all going, who's he talking about? You know, you're waiting to see who my eyes land on. And really, it's all of you. I mean, not me, but it's all of you. Here's why. A lawyer did a study of the legal system in America. And on average, you break 3 laws every day. Now, you don't do it intentionally. Mostly, the complexity of the legal system, the number of laws, the obscurity of some of the statutes and things, you couldn't possibly know all of the laws that are in existence. And so some of the times you will do it unintentionally, you'll do it out of ignorance. You didn't know that you were breaking the law. Other times we will, how do I put this politely? We will softly break the law. Maybe you don't think that the law is appropriate. And so as your little act of rebellion, you break the law as long as nobody sees you, right? And I won't tell. Other times we are careless about the law. Again, nobody that you know, but maybe you go 1 or 2 miles an hour over the speed limit. I know it sounds foreign. Maybe you don't come to a full and complete stop at stop signs. I know all of this is foreign to you, but all of that makes you a lawbreaker. All of that makes you guilty. Whether it's 1 or 2 miles or 10 or 20 or 100 miles over the speed limit, 1 or 2 or 100, it's the same thing. You're guilty. Rolling through the stop sign slowly, you're still guilty. Whatever law you break, you are still guilty in the eyes of the law. But for us, not so much. None of you came in this morning with your head hung down in shame, feeling badly because you had broken laws. That's just not the way we operate. So when it comes back to this, we're cautious about who we hang out with. We're cautious about not getting involved with people who are sinning, out in the open boldly. We're even very careful about not mocking things as far as we understand it. See, mockery is a lot like the law. We know what it is, but we're not 100% sure. Right? We know what it means to mock something. Like if I was making fun of you from up here on high, you would know clearly that I was mocking you. There would be no question about that. But when I call you a lawbreaker, I didn't see anybody's face turning red. I didn't see anybody feeling as though I had singled them out. So maybe I'm mocking you softly, or mocking you at a lower, whatever it is, right? We know what mockery is, but we're not sure when we see it. You know, mockery in church is one of those things we think we understand, and then we don't really. Here's an example. This room, out of all of the square footage in the church, is special. Agreed? Okay? We treat this room differently than we do every other room in the church. In fact, we treat this room differently than we do the old sanctuary. Somehow that has become open to new activity, but this room is different. We would not do the same things there. We're careful about what we do in this room. If the communion table was sitting up here, no one would come up and just sit on it, right? Now, you laugh, you're smiling, but think about that. If it's not in this room, if we wheeled it back to the back and decided we weren't going to use it anymore, everybody would be just fine sitting on it. But because it is a holy article, because it is something that we use in a sacred rite here in the church, we treat it differently. We behave differently in here. We watch our tongue, and we're careful about the behavior of the children and things here in this room. We do things differently because we don't want to make a mockery of God. We see things in this room as being differently. We would not put a swing rope up on that cross. That would be out of control mockery of the things of the cross. Yes? But would everybody in the world agree with us? No, they would not. They would look at that like, well, it's just a couple of boards thrown up against the window there. So you and I see it that way. Other people do not. And it works this way down in degrees as far as mockery is concerned. There are things we would definitely not ever, never, ever do. We would not swing from the cross. Nobody would sit on the communion table. But there are things that we have diminished in our minds in the same way that we think 1 or 2 miles is not speeding. Things we have diminished in our mind, things of God, that we don't consider mockery, but God does. If you remember when we were reading in Daniel, we finished chapter 4. And over and over and over, Nebuchadnezzar has made a proclamation of his belief in the God of Daniel. Yes? When the teenagers first arrived, they wanted to have a special diet because they were devoted to God. And so they were allowed to have that diet. God used that to reveal his power, to reveal the wisdom that he was going to show through these young men. And Nebuchadnezzar came to realize that something was different about these young men. And he said, this is great. These guys set them apart. Their God is super powerful. And then he has a dream, and Daniel interprets it. And when Daniel interprets it, he doesn't like the outcome, but he is amazed that Daniel's God has revealed this dream to him. And so he once again says how great and wonderful the God of Daniel is, how wonderful and powerful that God is. And then the young men get thrown in the fire. And God makes himself present there in the fire and walks them out without even the smell of smoke on them. And what does he say again? How wonderful and great and powerful is the God of Daniel. So over and over and over, he keeps saying how wonderful, how powerful God is, how great he is. And yet, not once does he stop, bless you, and think about what it means to say, Yes, that God, Yahweh, is the most powerful God of all of the gods. He doesn't stop and think what that means. He doesn't stop and think what he's saying when the words come out of his mouth. He's trying to show his belief in the power of this God, because God has shown it to him, and yet he doesn't stop and say, what's the impact of that belief? Well, God shows him. Remember, he has another dream. This is a little bit worse. God shows him this giant tree, right? This tree that covers the entire land, provides food, shade, everything. This tree is enormous. And Nebuchadnezzar's thinking, well, that's me. Look how awesome and wonderful I am. Until that tree is cut down. The tree is chopped down and the iron cap is placed over it so that it will not rise up again. That tree will not come back to life. Daniel says, this is you. This is you. You have refused to bow your knee to Yahweh. The one that you keep proclaiming is so great. You have refused to do that. So God is going to show you once again, God is going to show you how powerful he is, how he is in sovereign control of all of history. And God does. God bends him down and sends him out to eat grass in the field. Until what? Until he lifts his eyes and acknowledges that yes, Yahweh, the God of Daniel, is in control over all of history. And you remember at the end of that chapter, he's saying, the God of Daniel is the most awesome God. Everyone will worship him. Everyone will. And that's how it goes. And how many of us are convinced that this time he finally gets it? You see, by proclaiming his belief, by proclaiming his belief in the power of Yahweh and the belief in the power of Daniel's God, and then not acting upon it, he's mocking God. He's saying, yeah, God, you're awesome, but I'm more awesome. Yeah, God, you're in control of everything, except what goes on in Babylon here. I'm in control of that. And God over and over says, God says, I am in control of everything. Well, Nebuchadnezzar dies sometime after the end of chapter 4. And a new king is put in place. His son, Belshazzar. If you remember, that was Daniel's name. King Belshazzar plays it a little bit fast and loose. The beginning of chapter 5, it says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. I know you're all stunned, right? See, we don't read that in the light of its severity. In that one sentence, we have just been told that this king, this new king, Belshazzar, is of no moral and ethical quality. The fact that he is throwing this great banquet, this is not like, going to the buffet banquet. This is not tablecloths and linens and all this banquet. This is a wild bacchanal. This is a huge carry-on. And the fact that he is drinking, the fact that the king is drinking along with all the people that he has invited says that this party is completely out of control. We get all that from one sentence. So the stage is now set for something new. Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. The king doesn't eat with people. If the king was to show up at a banquet where anyone less than him, which is everybody, was to show up, the king might eat, but he would turn his back at everybody. He would sit separate, and he would turn his back. He would not look at anybody while it just wasn't done. But here he is drinking wine with everybody. He's not a man of faith. He doesn't say anything about his belief in the God of Daniel. Nothing. He's just a guy. The next sentence says, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. So now he's drinking wine with everybody else. He's kind of going along to get along. He wants to be everybody's pal, everybody's friend. He's partying with everybody, and now he's making bad decisions, like colossally bad decisions. You see, the holy items that Nebuchadnezzar had brought from Jerusalem, he didn't put them into the cupboard to use on special days. They were set off not to be touched. Nebuchadnezzar, for all of his faults, was smart enough not to play with the things of God. And he set them off, and he put them off in a separate room. He said, these belong to the God of Daniel, and they're not to be touched. Well, Belshazzar thinks he is much more powerful than this God. He's way more powerful than his dad, the former king. He can make these kind of decisions, and he's going to show everybody. So he says, bring those goblets out. Now, from what we know of God, God will just look the other way, right? God is just going to ignore this slight. God is not, small of stature. God is not easily hurt. His feelings are not easily crushed. And so he's going to look the other way when things that belong to him are brought out to this orgy that's going on in the palace. God will just look the other way. Except we know better. God may be patient. God may have unending mercy and grace. But there is a point where God says enough. There is a point where God says that's it. That's it. You have finally crossed the line. So they bring the goblets out. It says this after they brought the temple goblets out. So that the king and his nobles, now that's bad, the king's wives and his concubines, his girlfriends, might drink from them. Okay, he has already mocked God. He's already said, you're no God at all. Bring the goblets out here. Now, had the king perhaps just stopped right there and used them himself, maybe it wouldn't have been that bad. But he wants to show off a little bit, doesn't he? He takes the goblets and he's going to pass them around to everybody. Everybody who's involved in whatever morally questionable activity they're involved in, the holy goblets from the temple in Jerusalem are about to be used as Dixie cups at this party. They're about to get passed around here. And it gets worse. So they passed these around. They brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They clearly have not heard Psalm 1. They clearly have not exercised any thinking about what they're doing. Go get the goblets. Sin number 1. Bad decision. Let's everybody take a drink from them. You guys have never experienced this, right? Peer pressure, like, hey, come on, let's all get involved in this sin. Everybody here. I'm going to make bad decisions. You're going to make bad. Come on, all of this. And if that's not enough, if I haven't now pulled all of everybody into my bad choices, into my sin, into my wicked counsel, hey, I've got an idea. Let's take those goblets that we're treating as common trash. Let's take the goblets that belong to the God of Daniel. Let's get liquored up on them and then use those goblets to make a toast to our false idols up here. Come on, everybody, let's do it. And they do it. And you notice that not one person steps up and says, hey, maybe we ought to stop. Right? Because he's the king. He's the leader. He's the person that everybody's looking at. None of his nobles, none of his advisors Daniel, the teenagers, none of them come up and say, you're mocking something that you don't understand. Now, God has been patient. It took me, 30 seconds to read that. God has been patient for that full 30 seconds. For the full and complete time, God has taken all of this mockery. God has taken the mockery of Nebuchadnezzar. God has taken the mockery of Belshazzar here. But he's done. He's done. Listen to what happens. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster on the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. God says, enough. God says, I'm done. You think that because you're the king of Babylon, you can do anything you want. You think that because the queen is going to come in here in a few minutes and advise you to maybe change your ways, that I'm just going to forgive you. God looks down and he says, you have taken my goblets and I didn't act. You have used them for common purposes and I didn't act. I gave you another opportunity to change your mind. You passed around my holy goblets that belong in my temple, filled with wine. You passed them not just to nobles, you passed them to your girlfriends. And all of the nobles and their girlfriends, you passed them around like it was a red cup at a party. You did all that. And I didn't act. But finally, when Belshazzar thinks he can get away with one more thing, he raises a toast to the gods of Babylon. Not with a red solo cup, but with the holy goblet that belongs in the temple in Jerusalem. And God acts. God acts in the form of a hand. A human hand shows up out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall. Doesn't matter what it's writing. It's a human hand out of nowhere writing on the wall. And it's at that point that Belshazzar maybe says, my mockery went a little bit too far. Perhaps I did one step too far. Well, we're going to find out that what the hand is writing here makes it clear that he has gone too far. That he has not gone 1 or 2 miles an hour over the speed limit. That he not just rolled through the stoplight. That he didn't pay, the last 10 cents of his taxes. He has crossed a line that cannot be crossed back. His mockery has gotten out of control. Now, the question that we have is his mockery out of ignorance, or is his mockery intentional? We got to ask ourselves if we're in the same boat as Belshazzar. He has all the history behind him of the interaction just with God in Babylon. That should be more than sufficient. If he knew the story, and he must know the story of the 3 men that come out of the furnace that killed the king's soldiers, he must know that. So to cross the line and mock Yahweh in this way, I have to read this as intentional. I have to see that he's doing this on purpose. That he thinks what came to Nebuchadnezzar will never come to him. He thinks that Nebuchadnezzar, proclaiming the greatness of this God, his father saying over and over and over, how great is this God? How powerful is the God of Daniel? He said this over and over. Belshazzar must know this. And yet he does it anyway. He must know how great and powerful and in control Yahweh is, and yet he does this over and over and over. And so then I ask if you and I are not in the same boat as Belshazzar. You say, what are you talking about? We would never hang on the cross, Pastor. We don't sit on the communion table. We don't do any of those things. We're cautious not to run in the sanctuary. We have no mockery for God. But you know what I see over and over, like almost every day? I see people who are Christian hypocrites. Christian hypocrites. People who say one thing and do another. Just like Nebuchadnezzar. I say one thing. I say, how great and powerful is this God? And yet, no sooner do I turn back and proclaim myself to be the king of the world. No sooner do I see those young men come out of the furnace, a miracle in front of my eyes, that I turn back and I worship my little gods of clay and stone and wood. I say one thing. My Nebuchadnezzar says one thing, and he does another thing. We say one thing and do another thing. Now, we don't do it intentionally. I think we do it inadvertently. But whether we do it on purpose or we do it accidentally, we're still guilty. It's so easy for this kind of mockery, this hypocritical mockery, to worm its way, to work its way into our life. I mean, we think that God will accept whatever worship we throw his way. We think that God will accept whatever half-hearted worship we're willing to throw up his way. We are convinced that God will take whatever part-time faith we're willing to toss his way. We think that God will extend his grace to the infinite degree, no matter how much we mock him. You're saying, Pastor, how does this represent mockery? The same way as it does with Belshazzar. Belshazzar knew of the miracles that Nebuchadnezzar had seen. Belshazzar knew that over and over, God has proven that he is in sovereign control of everything. He knew everything that has happened as far as his father, the king, and the teenagers, the exiled teenagers had done. He knew all these things, and yet still, he makes a decision, the intentional decision, to go get those holy items and bring them in and use them. He makes the decision to make a mockery of the power of God by handling those implements in an inappropriate way. He mocks God by taking those holy goblets from the temple in Jerusalem and raising a toast to the false gods of Babylon. He knows all these things, and yet he thinks that God will let him get away with it. And we do the same thing. We do the same thing. The history of what God has done for you is not a mystery. You and I, everyone in here, knows what God has done. There is a fall in the beginning of history, and God says immediately, I'm going to set things right. God calls a people to himself. He says, you are going to be my witnesses. You are going to show what it means to be my people, and everyone around you will want to do it. They fail, and they fail, and they fail, and God says, it's okay. I'm going to fix this. God sends his son to atone for all the sin of all the people of all time. And his son dies. His son gives his life so that all of sin can be forgiven. All of sin can be forgiven, that we can be seen as righteous in God's eyes. And as the life is flowing out of Jesus, as his life force is giving up, is taking on the weight of all that sin. He's taking on the penalty. He's taking the full penalty that you and I deserve. You and I should have all that weight piled on our shoulder. You and I should be sent to eternal destruction for what we've done. You and I should pay that penalty, and yet God has intervened in history and said, I will pay that price. He does that, and he doesn't stop there. After Jesus has atoned for sin, taken all the sin of the world on, God lifts him from the grave. God rises him up from the grave and says, there's my power on full display. There it is. I have overcome everything. And then the Father and the Son entrust their spirit to you. They give their spirit to whoever will believe. The fullness of God, the full power of God in you. God entrusts that. And then we worship him halfway. And we look on that sacrifice and we just ignore it. We look on all that God has done for us. And listen, the best person in this room is still the least deserving of what God has done. And he did it for me. He did it for you. And he did it for whoever will believe. And we mock it. We mock it by being half-hearted in our worship. We mock it by being half-committed in our faith. We mock it by making it an as convenient thing. If I have time, I will commit it to God. If I can tear myself away, I will be there. I will be 100% committed to God. I will follow what God has commanded me to do. I will devote my life to that until I don't. Until I find something else that captures my attention. Until I just don't feel like it. And that puts us in the same boat as Belshazzar. The measure of faith in our life is not how obedient you are. Not how perfectly you can line yourself up with the 10 Commandments. It has nothing to do with any of that. The measure of your faith is your commitment to the worship of God. And I don't just mean the worship of God that we consider what goes on in this room, the worship of God when we're singing. Nothing as narrow as that. The worship of God is your full 100% commitment to the greatest thing that anyone or anything will ever do for you in your life. Your greatest problem is that sin separates you from God. The greatest solution has been done on your behalf. God has made the sacrifice so that you can be seen in his eyes as righteous. And what we do with that is a demonstration of our faith. If we are half-hearted in commitment to that, we are half-hearted in our commitment to that, we are doing something as bad as what Belshazzar is doing. We're mocking the sacrifice. God gave all, and we give so little. We give so little. And I worry about that a lot. I fear that a lot. Because as we saw with Belshazzar, God finally says, enough. Enough. He said, you have mocked me. You have mocked my sacrifice. You have mocked my son. You have mocked the holy cross on which he died for you. Enough. Enough. We hear Psalm 1, and we consider that sequence of things. Don't take counsel from the wicked. Check, I got that. Don't run around with people who are going to involve you in their sin. Check, I got that. Don't sit in the seat of mockers. That's where our weakness comes forth. That's where our weakness wells up. And we mock God without even thinking about it. Without even stopping to think that what we might be doing is mocking the sacrifice that he's made for us. Over the last 30 minutes, you and I have been blessed beyond reason. Here's why. A hand has not appeared and written on that wall. A hand has not appeared and written across that wall that we have been measured, that we have been tested, that we have been weighed, and we have been found to be lacking. And while we should be beyond thankful for that, we should take that as a blessing that says, you have one more minute, maybe one more hour. If we are super blessed, we will get one more day. And I'm going to go way out on a limb here. God may grant us one more year to believe and to commit ourselves to that belief. And to commit ourselves to the degree to which we find ourselves grateful for what Jesus did on that cross. Blessed. Blessed. You and I just don't realize that when we open our eyes in the morning, how blessed we are to have been given one more day. One more day to address the things in our life. To check and see whose counsel we're taking, to see who we're hanging around with, and this is the most important thing, to make sure that there is not a scintilla of mockery in the life of devotion that we show towards Christ. Amen? Mm-hmm. Let's